One of the most common issues I witness for adults with childhood trauma is the absolute struggle to do real intimacy with our partners and to get issues resolved so that we can deepen our connection and grow as a couple. Like, wouldn't that be nice? But as childhood trauma survivors, we usually find ourselves in codependent trauma-based relationships where we're trying to fix our own childhood through a person who most likely has their own childhood trauma of their own going on, and their inner child is doing the same thing with us. Childhood trauma gets fixed really by doing deep work on ourselves, not by replaying patterns with our partners, but that's kind of like what we all do unconsciously until we work on ourselves. And the first step out of that kind of mess is making that unconscious battle that we do with our partners conscious, which is what this video is going to be about. So I'd like to take a deep look into trauma-based codependent relationships and figure out their function with each other. If you're not familiar with like the concept of codependency, I did a video on codependency as it pertains to childhood trauma. I'll have the link in the description. You can check that out. And there's often a perfect storm going on to these connections, like kind of a peanut butter to chocolate kind of perfection. They just go together, but here they don't go together for good reasons. And as a side note, I've titled this video to be about trauma-based relationships, not trauma-bonded, which is more of when like a victim or a hostage gets bonded with their perpetrator, like in a Stockholm syndrome kind of a thing. Trauma-based is more about two individuals being run by their trauma, but they're not really, they don't have the dangerous stuff of, say, violence or exploitation or sexual exploitation going on. You might identify as being in one of these couples right now. You might have had these trauma-based codependent relationships with an ex, and you're definitely going to see this within your own parental systems growing up, some of these 5 lists. So let's dive in. I'm going to be talking about what each of the 5 types look like, how each individual's trauma contributes to the problem, as well as some therapy goals for each of the partnership. And I'll be giving recommendations also about therapy towards the end. Also, these dynamics are not really, they may feel gender specific, but they're not really gender specific. These show up in all kinds of partnerships, and all kinds of folks can have different roles. So let's dive in. Number 1 is something that I call aggressor codependent. You might remember this type in a video that I did on 7 types of toxic family systems. It's the same couple, same idea. This one is actually from my parents' type of trauma-based bond, straight from the TN family playbook, but it's actually pretty extremely common for childhood trauma relationships. Aggressor codependent is when one of the pair is aggressive, and that can look like anything from being extremely moody to somewhat violent to being controlling, giving silent treatments to being super strong-willed, domineering, like I'm the most important person in this couplehood because of A, B, and C. And it doesn't have to be the aggressor is a full-on nasty, like perpetrating behavior. It can also be someone who is highly neurotic and comes with a lot of special rules and considerations that others have to abide by or submit to. The aggressor is a force to kind of deal with, and it often feels oppressive. The codependent in the partnership can range in behaviors like trying to kill the aggressor with kindness, not being real about how bad the aggressor's behavior is. They can be controlling themselves by being aggressive in their own way, but they will not address or leave or get fully honest about what's really going on. And to confuse the whole thing further, they both can switch between who is the aggressive person, who is the codependent person. So why is this trauma-based relationship, why is the connection so strong? Again, think peanut butter and chocolate, like the perfect combination. Let's look at it from the each individual's childhood trauma. In the aggressor codependent, there is a childhood trauma struggle on many levels. You know, the aggressor can be acting out childhood trauma in any of the following ways. They can be demanding to be seen and be heard or taken seriously because that never happened for them growing up. If you think like kind of a Napoleon kind of complex kind of a thing. And I know this sounds weird, but like the aggressor can be demanding atonement for the imaginary sins from the codependent. I normally don't use religious language, but it's kind of a good analogy here. They can have a punishing nature to them. The codependent partner is really paying for what the aggressor's parents did during their abusive childhood. And it's now like, you owe me kind of stuff. They can be really self-righteous and in loud and quiet ways, and this can be learned from their own toxic family system. And the aggressor's vibe can be like, how could you? Or when are you going to get it? Or I told you a million times. And their main thing is often using mood as a weapon. and they act out again from that old family of origin wounds and fights. The codependent can be acting out of their childhood trauma in the following ways. And again, don't just think of the codependent as going to be a people pleaser only. There are many types. They are aggressive too in their own way. They are trying to receive love and tolerance again from an aggressor. They are familiar with trying to soothe or trying to placate a weaponized, moody person, just like in childhood. They can be highly controlling, believing that coaxing or appeasing or criticizing or playing games might change the aggressor's behavior. This can be both learned from their own parents, or it's like an old relational survival strategy of like contempt for each other. They're pretty compartmentalized to how bad things really are, and their childhood trauma may have set them up to be really removed from the reality about what's going on. Like they may not have a reference point for the toxicity because they grew up in it. Perhaps that was just modeled for them, or they have no idea what's normal, just like kind of like the aggressor who is somewhat fine with crappy behavior. Like the other bonds on this list, the couple is fixed in like a dance of trying to resolve their childhoods with each other. The aggressor does so by getting someone to come clean about how insensitive or foolish they are, and the codependent is trying to get the aggressor to wake up out of their moodiness or nastiness and see their value. It's kind of a power struggle about getting the other person to get it. Let's look at some healing goes for each individual. This is how I kind of formulate in my mind when I used to see couples after I really get to know them and their trauma story. I think the aggressor's work is to really look at how their family of origin set them up to not value or honor intimacy. They will really devalue their partner or their connection or intimacy, which is sad. They'll do that by their self-righteousness and their nastiness. And that behavior can leave them really disconnected from their partner or from the family that they're trying to raise. The aggressor also needs to look at their own family system and switch from holding their partner overly accountable to holding their abusive family system accountable for what went down in childhood. For both of these, modeling aggressive intimacy and all the stuff about not being seen or being let down or being treated like garbage, and again, the aggressor is looking to punish the wrong person. But why? All of this is subconscious content that kind of fuels the rage and the self-righteousness. Hopefully that makes sense. Due to all that rage or hypersensitivity, the aggressor will struggle with knowing how they negatively impact their partner. And they'll need to kind of hit bottom with their behavior, which is kind of a first step. Unfortunately, many aggressors feel totally justified in their behavior due to like their own fight response. Like you've heard me talk about something called lawyer mode. The codependent's work is to look at how their own family system set them up for dealing with an aggressive person to try to get to be seen, to get some love going on. And they too have to switch the controlling behavior, such as acting like a martyr, which they can do, or or the behavior around making everything work towards their partner, to holding their abusive family system accountable for making love conditional. So they could have been the codependent person could have been parentified or scapegoated, or they could have been modeled for them to ignore abusive behavior and become selfless, or to become too self-involved, or even victimized. I know it's confusing, but many of you have had a codependent parent like this that was like a covert narcissist and highly manipulative. And the codependent's individual work is going to be around processing that they had nothing to work with growing up. And they just had to make do, or they really had no idea what healthier intimacy is available out there or what it looks like. The same is true for the aggressor. The codependent will also need to assist the aggressor in hitting bottom by establishing new firm boundaries, like you can't talk to me like that, instead of just going into the upset with them. And lastly, this does not work with aggressors who are somewhat violent or emotionally violent, who have no insight or really have no intent on making things better. So also, I'm Patrick Tian. I'm a licensed clinical therapist specializing in childhood trauma and abusive family systems. If you like this video, feel free to hit some buttons on the screen. You really can't miss with any of the buttons, especially the like button or the subscribe button. And if you're stuck in your recovery and want to add a resource or some therapy work that you're already doing, I host a monthly healing community membership. We meet twice a month for live Q&As about childhood trauma and inner child work. I send send out weekly journal prompts every Monday to keep members engaged and kind of on board. And you also get all access to all my childhood trauma e-coursework that I offer there, as well as just getting some kind of sense of community with other people who are doing similar work. If you go right up to the ball right here, it takes you right to the membership. And I'll also have, if you're interested in looking at my website or joining up on my Patreon, I'll have all the links in the description to this video, including my social media links. So moving on to number 2, this is what I call the doer and the tag along. This is a trauma-based couple where one person makes the doer, makes the whole partnership or family life happen, and the other person is just kind of along for the ride for the most part. Some examples: tag along never contributes to any kind of planning or contribution about intimate time or addressing things in conversation, and they've really found someone to join in with who might just kind of handle all that for them. And it feels like an extremely immature partner, because unfortunately it is. The tag-along doesn't arrange or discuss weekend plans, vacations, preferences, holidays. They will only kind of ask you, a good example is, they only ask you what you might want for your birthday instead of taking initiative or doing the same thing around the holidays. And their main approach to things is like doing whatever is the easiest, as well as doing kind of a minimum. I know that that sounds harsh, but this is a shutdown trauma-based presentation. They can also be caught up in being in like an isolative coping strategy, such as excessive gaming or excessive working or some substance abuse or excessive hobbying. Tag-alongs can be pretty immature. They can be pretty shut down, compartmentalized, or simply kind of limited and shame-based, not knowing how to contribute to have a relationship. If you are the doer, the tag-along will feel like an additional child, not an adult partner. I know that that also sounds harsh. The doer is rooted in control and providing a life both by habit and also by trauma, but also kind of by necessity. Having, say, children with the tag-along is often extremely difficult, as they seem more like an employee rather than a co-parent. The doer usually does not know how to have a totally reciprocal relationship due to control. And in some ways, the peanut butter and chocolate of this is that the doer can do a dance with the tag-along as constantly voicing letdown and criticism and disgust, but never sees the tag-along's limitation or childhood trauma, like trying to get blood from a stone, which is like the hallmark of codependency. That may not seem fair to the doer, but both parties in all of these couplehoods contribute to the bond and the dance and the cycles. The doer, due to their trauma, usually controls the intimacy by being superior or self-righteous. We really have to ask and look at, what is the function of being in such a relationship? What do both parties get out of their dysfunction subconsciously? Let's look at some possible childhood trauma origins for this couple. The tag-along can certainly have been infantilized, which means to not be challenged by their family system for age-appropriate goals, from like making a meal for themselves when they're 12 to getting themselves out of the house in their 20s. The tag-along could also have been raised in any of the following situations. And again, think about their childhood trauma origin, like growing up in extreme chaos and poverty, growing up extremely shut down in an extremely shut down or neglectful family system, growing up in an extremely controlling environment where they're just kind of now playing their part, which was to be pushed around with no voice, or kind of in an oppressive, rigid environment. They can also have come from an extremely limited family system where no one knows like how to host a house guest. Leaving the tag-along totally unprepared and kind of unparented around basic things in life. Could also be from a physical or medical trauma-based childhood. Could also be from having a parent that was a tag-along themselves, and it was simply modeled for them that that's kind of how things roll. The doer could have been raised in any of the following. In, say, a family with a lot of chaos or substance abuse or poverty or neglect, they really behave almost like an adult child of an alcoholic kind of family system. There can be strong examples of them being parentified, where they were set up and habituated to do for others. but now it's done with a lot of resentment that they couldn't feel in childhood. It could come from having ill parents or extremely emotionally limited parents. It can also come from being extremely let down and abandoned in childhood, such as, like, again, with an alcoholic parent. The doer will have difficulty letting someone show up for them and have a reciprocal relationship. Say a tag-along is now working on themselves and trying to show up more. The doer may struggle with giving up some control and also maybe not seeing a good enough effort from the tag-along when they're trying to work on it. Let's look at each person's healing goals. The tag-along will benefit from insight in figuring out how their family system set them up for not knowing how to really be part of a partnership or do intimacy. They'll usually struggle with insights into why, but that doesn't mean they can't get that insight with some therapy help. The tag-along needs to reparent their inner child around kind of the hiding or the staying in an immature standpoint that they do and how that affects their partner. And then the work is going to be around being consistent and showing up more and engaging more, doing something without having to be told to do something is almost like a treatment goal for a tag-along. Tag-alongs really struggle with initiative, which often tells their trauma story, but also greatly contributes to the mess in their relationship. The tag-along can also have an inner child wound belief that is like something like, damned if I do, damned if I don't. They're somewhat vigilant around not contributing because that might lead to scrutiny, which could also happen from the doer who scrutinizes. And a good therapy goal is to learn some conflict skills and speaking up and to do some intimacy work and showing up, even if that comes from like the doer's inner child. Hopefully that makes sense. The doer can also be caught up in a damned if you do, damned if you don't type inner child wound. Like they might sort of say, see, this is why I can't rely on you because you don't load the dishwasher right. And that's a statement from their inner child. And again, peanut butter and chocolate, that's a not good enough kind of statement if the tag-along is making effort. So that's that one. Moving on, number 3 is what I call the absorber and the enabler. Absorber and enabler happens when the absorber takes on the enabler's life, their sense of self, their purpose, or their mission for lack of having one of their own due to their childhood trauma. And again, think about degrees of severity in this. You might have seen this in your own parents where one of your parents is all about like the partner's business or their time in the military, or they're all about their family. It's almost like they put them up on a pedestal or something like that, that feels really off. One individual in the couple has something going on, whether it could be anything, a business, could be a disability, could be some kind of mission that they're on, or some kind of simply their trauma story, and the other absorbs the whole thing and takes on that mission. The absorber struggles with having no identity or personhood of their own, and they may also struggle with dissociation with childhood trauma. And the absorber can also become the champion of the enabler, like I mentioned, or putting them on a pedestal. They can completely lose themselves in the enabler's life. Championing someone can also mean championing an enabler's illness or bad luck or disability, like really rooting for them. I've had clients who had a tragically medically ill parent, and they described their other parent as absorbing the whole situation as if it was their whole new identity, absorbing and championing, or overly identifying with the ill parent. You might have had a narcissistic parent kind of absorb one of your siblings' life. It could also look like that. Same idea. It's like about living vicariously through somebody. The enabler contributes to all this by letting it happen. Here's a hypothetical to spell out the enabler's kind of part in this. Say you own a cupcake store and it's booming. You meet someone you like, but they become all about your success. And I don't mean that from like an exploitive financial way. I mean from the way that they start talking about it to all of their friends. They only talk about you, and it's kind of obsessive, and you might feel a little bit creeped out. This absorber crosses some boundaries due to their dissociation, and it's almost like they talk as if it's your cupcake store together. And you'll probably be weirded out about the absorber inserting themselves into you or to your life with that kind of intensity. Has anyone out there dated somebody who went 1,000% into your own family system when you introduce them to that, like too much too soon. You may also have kind of done that yourself, because as childhood trauma survivors, we're usually looking for that, that healthy family finally that we can be part of. But back to the enabler, they might be fine with all that cupcake store stuff, which is really odd when you think about it. They might not catch that their partner, their new partner, is inserting themselves into their lives, or worse, the enabler might benefit from having things be all about them, and they're kind of crossing boundaries too for themselves, because their new babe is like they're now their best employee at the cupcake store. That's kind of the other side to this. The enabler's ego might also enjoy that they have one identity and not two separate healthy ones. So in couples who have this dynamic going on, the absorber relies too heavily on a sense of self from the enabler, and the enabler lets all that happen and doesn't challenge and that's really not a good thing. Let's look at some possible childhood trauma origins for both of these. While it seems like this is all about the absorber, it's really not. Again, it's 50-50. The enabler allows for this lack of self and doesn't catch how off it is. The enabler could have grown up in any of the following situations. Growing up in abusive homes where one parent mattered most and enabling was actually modeled. Growing up as something like the golden child, where you're told directly or indirectly you matter the most in the family and you don't know what to do with other people's lives. That actually happens. Growing up in abuse and your own sense of self is off. The enabler can be dissociative too and not know where the line is where they end and their partner begins. That concept is very common for childhood trauma survivors. I had that going on myself, of not knowing where the line was between you and the other person. Because when we grow up, the boundaries or the attunement is so off, or the neglect was so extreme, that we really are kind of free-floating in that way. The absorber may have grown up in any of the following situations. Abandonment and neglect is definitely going to be a piece of this in their daily life growing up. Growing up where someone else in the family was the high and the only priority in the family, kind of, similar to the enabler. Or growing up in chaos or poverty or shame or substance abuse, where someone else in life can seem to them like a safety raft, like the enabler is like an oasis. Or growing up in a family where they were really an anonymous child, like there was no mirroring, no real connection. Parents didn't really know them, so how can they know themselves? Let's look at each person's healing goals. The absorber will need to look at how they were so disconnected in their family system and grieve that kind of loss of their own natural development and the loss of being attached to a secure person. They could also benefit from learning how to connect with their inner child and reparent them, and like every other childhood trauma survivor, become more integrated with self as opposed to see integration with others. We really need to get it from ourselves before we can really show up to a relationship fully. They will also have to do the hard emotional work of starting to practice having their own life with their own goals and their own interest. They're like so selfless, they'll need to build up a new sense of self, which is really hard, but it's not impossible. And as a side note here, if you had a parent who didn't have a full life, they might have been an absorber or even a tag-along. The enabler will need to figure out why from their own family system about why they're okay with a partner who doesn't have their own full rich life going on. Exploring how this kind of normal thing got lost is going to be tricky, but what was it about their upbringing that taught them to be comfortable with having a partner who is selfless and just there? They'll need to look at how they benefit from having someone be all about them and why it's not good. And it's almost like, how do you not feel that? And this is their own codependency rooted in their childhood trauma. And now moving on to number 4 is something that I call Stonewall and Chase. Perhaps this is the easiest couple to explain. Stonewalling is a term you might be familiar with. It's taken from the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. In relationships, those 4 horsemen is really what leads to divorce, according to a gentleman named John Gottman, who developed the 4 horsemen in his Gottman Method for couples. Stonewalling contempt, criticism, and defensiveness are the 4. Stonewalling is withdrawing from the relationship due to overwhelm or shutting down or flooding. It involves avoiding conflict, and it involves actually avoiding eye contact, and the person usually goes silent. It can often look like it's done on purpose to the person watching it happen, and you can actually see children do it when they experience shame or when they're in trouble. Stonewalling, by definition, isn't a tactic or manipulation. It's a biological response. It differs from purposeful silent treatments or punishing someone with silence, which is a tactic and a manipulation. Silent treatments that are purposeful don't really qualify for the true definition of Gottman's stonewalling. And as a side note, silent treatments, really want you to take this in, that are intentional to punish are perhaps one of the most toxic behaviors that one can engage in a relationship, any kind of relationship. If that was done to you as a kid, you know what the damage is like. Stonewalling is really rooted more in a biological response due to their childhood trauma, but to the partner who is the chaser, they often don't know that or know what to do with it. Depending on their trauma, the chaser can experience rage and attack the stonewaller more for stonewalling, and do the other 3 of the 4 horsemen, which is criticism, contempt, and defensiveness. And they can behave like very, very anxious, or like an anxious preoccupied attachment style, and become really activated when the stonewaller leaves. They can go to a really codependent worrying place. The pattern is, something comes up for this couple, and the chaser might want to address it or talk about it when it comes up. This causes the stonewaller, who has a really limited window of being able to be present for conflict and emotional intimacy, shuts down and or avoids or kind of leaves the room physically or emotionally. Nothing gets resolved, and the stonewaller usually can't handle the issue at hand, and the chaser is left with that anger, or could be the anxiety or worry, and the thing just gets fizzled out, and the couple somehow silently repairs, what do you want for dinner? Making it about something else, or that new show episode is out, do you want to watch with me? Like, that's their repairing, not addressing the thing underneath. Here's how a stonewaller, if that's even a word, and chaser, how this might originate in their childhood trauma. For the person who stonewalls, they may have grown up in any of the following: extremely high conflict family systems, or shutting down, where shutting down was a good strategy for them, or they had a parent who would get flooded as well and leave situations, and it's modeled. They might have experienced catastrophic abusive attention if they spoke up or made a mistake, and they were really made to be put on the spot in an abusive way. That's a very common one. Or they grew up in an oppressed, avoidant family system where no one knew how to handle emotions of any kind. Like, emotions have such a huge charge to them. For the chaser, they could have grown up in any of the following: a parent who did use mood as a weapon and did engage in silent treatments, or a family that held like big secrets until one day the secret was out or it ruptured, completely changing everyone's life. Like, the chaser is like hypervigilant about something being wrong, remember. Growing up where they had to constantly check in or worry about a parent's mental health, like a vigilant child, or they could have a childhood just rooted around distrust and abandonment. Let's look at each person's healing goals. In therapy, the person who stonewalls will need to figure out why their system floods and go to that flight place, to be able to discuss in safety with the therapist and get that childhood trauma content in order to process why they were conditioned that way. They will also need to do some work around increasing their window of tolerance, to be able to stay in the intimacy more and more, or stay in the conflict more and more, and not go to that biological leaving place, little bit by little bit. They'll also need to learn their impact on their partner when they emotionally leave the room. When this is a big thing about childhood trauma. When we're self-consumed in a trigger, we don't really have the capacity to think about why that's not good for the partnership or what it's like for the other person. The inner child can also have some really big beliefs going on, like, you don't know how hard this is for me, and not see that belief erases their partner in the whole thing. For the partner who chases, they'll need to look at how their family systems set them up to be angry or super worried about their partner who shuts down. To get that childhood trauma content, again, is crucial to look at the ways that they were conditioned. This couple presentation outlines a recovery goal for most childhood trauma survivors, and this is big. I really want you to take this in, which is simply letting somebody have their feelings. The chaser is letting the person who stonewalls, letting them have space and letting there be silence and have that not be so bad so that they can be more safe and come back into it, is letting them have their feelings. And the stonewaller, same thing, letting their partner be a little bit angry, letting their partner being concerned and still be present for it, letting the other person have their feelings or being more comfortable with that. In childhood, other people's feelings were like the threat, so it makes sense about why we do that. So moving on to the last one, number 5, this one's what I call we're getting the band back together. This couple is in a long-standing breakup and repair pattern that can expand years and sometimes decades in the most extreme examples. They don't exactly have separate functions like an absorb or enable. They both do the same thing, which is a cyclical process of ending and then getting back together via like drama and magical thinking. Some clients that I've had have had parental systems that their parents had an extremely dysfunctional marriage, so they got divorced, and then they remarried, and then they cheated on their new partner with each other from the first marriage, and then eventually they got back together only to divorce again some years later, and now they're texting again. So that's like a very extreme version of that. And this type of couple isn't really a trauma-based connection that is related to their childhood trauma, and I often find it to be rooted in 2 inner children having a lot of magical thinking and selective amnesia about how bad things get in this pairing, and there's really no inner adult present at all. This is really a couple that they're totally run by their inner child. Not that the others aren't, but you know, kind of like what I mean. I often find that in addition to magical thinking or immature thinking, if you have this cycle going on for it can really be fueled by being drawn into a relational drama cycle. Perhaps the drama fuels the magical thinking. It's like, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I'm taking you to court, I love you kind of stuff. That's a lot, you know, people can get addicted to that cycle. This couple has great difficulty closing the door after a breakup. They keep the door open by occasionally texting or rehashing old fights or doing drama switches like, I never meant that, I was only doing it for you. And they might also be overly social still with each other, which is a terrible idea for this couple after a breakup. The boundaries are always porous instead of firm and locked down after a breakup. Keeping the door closed after a breakup, that feels like, you know, I wish you the best, I'll see you around. Not like, I'm going to call your mom on her birthday tomorrow, hope that's okay. That's keeping the door while you're still in their life. So this also tends to be like a drama Disney love story fantasy going on for this couple, and it might look like this. Like if we try again and we make it work, then that truly means that we're together forever. How this might originate in their childhood trauma. The getting the band back together couple could have experienced any of the following in their childhood trauma. They could have experienced a lot of chaos and a lot of abandonment. They could have a lot of shame and low self-esteem where they find it doesn't sound good. It's almost like they're comfortable with someone who is just as dysfunctional on their level. They can come from family systems with extremely immature parents who also had a Disney version of what a loving or what a partnership looks like. They could have come from families with extremely low emotional intelligence who can't name or access patterns. They can come from families that are rooted in a lot of drama themselves. And a big issue is usually growing up in families where abusive members are really never truly held accountable, meaning no one is ever listed as truly bad or dangerous. And the door is never closed on a dysfunctional or abusive person. So in that family where the drunk, weird Uncle Ted comes by who's all touchy-feely, that's an example where there's no one's ever bad. So there's like the door is always open. Let's look at some healing goals for them. Each partner will need to look at their childhood and figure out why they engage in magical thinking and drama so much. Why do they have such an immature idea of what intimacy really is? And why are they drawn to the on and off again drama cycle? which is a really difficult cycle, to be honest, when you really tap into it. They'll also need to explore if it's coming from shame and low self-esteem, like I mentioned. Why do they fall back into something that isn't good for them? And exploring this with a good therapist might help them find a more resolved inner adult who can catch the patterns and set limits with themselves. They'll also need support in therapy around keeping the door closed for both parties around working on themselves individually. Like with all the other types on this list, each individual needs to connect with their inner child and create an internal security from integration, because it's like they keep seeking a rescue or perfect from now on fantasy with each other when they know it's not good for them, but they just can't help themselves. Here are my recommendations and final thoughts for these 5 types, or in general. It's going to sound weird, but I actually don't recommend couples therapy initially for these couples. I really believe that they need to do individual work and explore their childhoods with a good trauma therapist who gets abusive family systems. And I know it feels like I'm suggesting that I might as well just casually suggest you take a trip to the moon, because I know how hard it is to find somebody like that. Or even harder to have a partner who's willing to kind of look at their own stuff and do their own work individually. So that's also a huge red flag. Why not couples? I find that couples can help, but there's also so much in each individual's childhood trauma running the partnership that it's best to get some real headway into that first. Couples therapy can feel like really a long slog when only one member or no members have real insight into their childhood trauma responses. And you just might end up kind of mucking around in the present, like, why don't you ever answer my text? Or why don't you ever take initiative? Or why do you get so upset when I forget the cheesy poops? Or all that kind of present stuff. But, nothing's really set in stone. If you need immediate help from a couples therapist and individual isn't available to you, I just recommend going find a Gottman trained couples therapist. Lastly, I don't mean to be demeaning towards any of these types. I truly believe we all are set up in our abusive family systems to struggle, and no one really knows how to do intimacy. Many of us are just caught in these nasty cycles that aren't good for us, and many of us are just shooting in the dark. If you're in a partnership like this, or you're watching this together as a couple, I have some simple reflective questions. Are you able to talk about your patterns with each other without a big blow up or a shutdown? Maybe this video can actually help you name some things. When I work with couples, I at least want them to be able to talk to each other on their own and peacefully say to each other, like, oh, here we are again. We're doing that thing, and not fully engage in a big slog fest or don't talk to each other for 3 days or something like that. The second reflective question is, do you know your part of what you might bring into the dysfunction? Do you really know it? Do you think it's really 50-50 that you're contributing, or do you feel like it's more 70 them, 30 you? Find a safe, psych-minded person, hopefully a therapist, and can see or give you some feedback on that. Like, why isn't it 50-50 in your mind? Or you might really know what your part is, and that's cool too. And the third reflective question is, do you see these patterns or types in your own parental system from your own childhood? Might this stuff be learned? Do you see that kind of patterns in others? Do you have friends like this? Have you been in these situations yourself? It's actually more common than you think. So I hope that all this was helpful. I know it was long, but I'd love to hear if you resonate with these, or if you're currently stuck in them, or if you found a way to get out of it. How did you do that? I bet people would love to hear about that. And also, do you have questions about anything that I discussed in the video? So, as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well, may you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. Take care, and I will see you next time.